We talked about the review process immediately after the successful deployment of the system or the software that we developed. How about the periodic review? Why do we have periodic reviews? Well, we need to make sure that this thing that we so successfully deployed and it's working is still working, that there haven't been untoward changes. Maybe the environment is shifting a bit and this thing needs to be tweaked or updated because it worked great then, but it's not quite keeping up with a changing need or demand or environment. How about the change control? Was that done effectively and appropriately? And when we did come up with recommendations from the post-deployment review, have they been implemented? So these are things that we need to periodically check. How often? Well, it kind of depends. At least once a year, maybe every 6 months if you can, if you're really lucky every quarter, but that's probably not very likely. So we have to periodically review how well this new thing is working. When we're talking about the periodic review, we might run into some communication challenges. So we have to have the users and developers on board. We need to go ask them, is this thing still meeting your requirements? Is it still meeting your objectives? What about the components developers or infrastructure people? How is this thing still running for you? We need to get their input when we do the periodic review. We shouldn't just trust what manager says. We should look at logs and we should get input of the people who use it and input of the people who developed it as well. As we do periodic reviews, whatever that time period is, we'll want to be able to see audit trails. We'll want to be able to compare. Well, we saw that this problem was reported right during pilot. We saw the same problem was reported during release. We saw the same problem was reported during this periodic review, so that we can call it the problem to attention. And if we can tie the problem to a loss of productivity, or a loss of effectiveness, or a loss of income or competitiveness or something, that really helps get management's attention. So you'll want to be looking at audit trails and like the whole story. Okay, so back in this date, we had this much information. Later, we had this much. Later, we had this much. And so we'll want to be able to show the audit trail, and we'll want to be able to see the audit trail. This has been going on for what, 2 years, and it's been reported every quarter. When we're doing periodic system review, also quality assurance is always going to play a role. Quality assurance had to be there during the SDLC itself, during the development process itself. And quality assurance has to be here in the post-implementation while this thing is in production, to always make sure that this thing is meeting objectives. We're enforcing standards. We're enforcing things like naming conventions. This thing is producing something that is correct or valid. It's producing data that is valid. It doesn't have any errors. So the quality assurance process needs to always be involved, even after we have rolled this thing out. Different QA methods. We've got some examples here. Failure testing. I love to stress test applications and systems. I love to run load simulators until they break, just to see how they behave. I love to run load simulators to the point where the operating system can no longer even report its processes. It's just stopped responding to monitoring tools, and just to see how far we can push it. Because this is what we need to know under real life, what's it going to be like. So we can failure test, stress test. We deliberately push it till it fails or breaks. And we're trying to find out its total limits, upper and lower limits of operation. Also, when we're doing QA, we want to make sure that we keep those failures within an acceptable number. So we'll want to have some control of the status, the statistics of the numbers of failures. And then, of course, we may have to do regression testing. If we did a patch or a fix, let's run the tests again to make sure that we didn't break something else. We didn't introduce new errors. The application, you need to keep safe copies. And if you bought this thing, keep the licenses too. I've got terrible stories of managers who went to clean out closets and saw boxes of stuff and threw it away, didn't realize that they were throwing away the licenses of all of the software that they had bought and deployed. And then they had to provide the licenses, and they couldn't, and then they couldn't prove that they owned that stuff because they didn't bother to register either. And so then now they had to pay the licensing twice, and they've had to pay fines. So with the media, we need to make sure that there is a media library and that clean, good copies always exist in a known place, stored safely, where it's clean and dry and not too humid and not too hot and not too dusty and not too dry, and no direct sunlight, and all of these things to keep the media clean and safe, and stacked like this, not stacked like this. And we'll need that clean media in case we have to reinstall something or recover something. And of course, we need to make sure that there's only authorized access to this clean media. And so we have a media custodian who keeps it all locked up. And it could be as simple as just the manager keeps it locked in a storeroom with other equipment, or some part of the IS department keeps clean copies. What we have to be careful of, with licensed stuff, is that the IS department, in wanting to have the convenience of everyone having a copy, will start duplicating the disk. And so one thing, I suppose, if you have a volume license, but if not, then you have to be careful, especially if they start using up licenses. And it's one of those things where the license then gets registered online with the vendor, and now you can't use that license when a legitimate user actually needs it. So you have to have some control over the install media. So when we are doing a system review of the SDLC, when we're auditing, there are two major things, and there's a very nice checklist we can take a look at here. Two major areas that get audited during the review: the project management activities. So if I'm going to be auditing, if I'm going to do the system review, I'll look at what was the adequacy of the oversight, what was the risk management, the issue management, the cost management, the planning and dependency management, the reporting of the processes to senior management, the change control, the management of the stakeholders and their participation, how processes were signed off. In the SDLC documentation also, for each phase, I wanted to see the deliverables that were organized by SDLC phase. So I want to see documentation for the concept and initiation, the requirements, the design, the development, the testing, the deployment, the post-deployment. And we'll want to see the schedule that focuses on producing the deliverables organized by date, and also any economic forecasts for this life cycle phase, including the costs of everything involved with this. So these are all things that we're going to be looking at when we are auditing the SDLC. So when we are performing periodic system reviews, we've already deployed this thing, we had a post-deployment review, it was good, and 6 months later or a year later or a quarter later, we're doing a periodic review. We need to meet with not only the users but also the dev staff, the people who developed it, or the system administrators, or the IT staff that developed the system. Make sure that the main objectives and the components and the user requirements are still met. We want to try to participate in any post-implementation reviews. We want to be involved in that. And of course, we need to see who was involved. We want to, where applicable, review the project management activities and review the documentation and the project management documentation, and make sure that the user and customer requirements were met and signed off on. Make sure that test management was done properly, if they applied everything so that ultimately this thing supports the business objectives. And I want to see test results too. And if possible, if they exist, I also want to see any controls to help always manage and mitigate the risk associated with this new system that we've deployed.